The town of Redemption Creek had a favorite joke, and her name was Clara. At 30, she was a widow, a solitary figure who lived on the edge of town where the prairie grass met the rise of the stony hills. Her joke wasn't her quiet nature or the way she kept to herself, it was the dirt. For nearly 2 years, the woman had been moving earth, digging into the hillside behind her small cabin with a singular, obsessive focus. With her was always her dog, a magnificent German shepherd named Rook, whose dark, intelligent eyes watched the town with a suspicion his owner never showed. The townsfolk called her Project Clara's Folly. From the porch of the general store, they would watch her small figure silhouetted against the setting sun, a shovel in her hand, Rook a loyal shadow at her feet. Mr. Gable, the portly owner of the store, would lean back in his chair, a toothpick dancing in his lips. "There she goes," he'd chuckle to the men gathered there. "Digging her own grave, I reckon. A woman ought to be tending a hearth, not a hole in the ground." The laughter that followed was easy and cruel, the kind that bonded men in their shared, simple understanding of the world. They saw a woman touched by grief, lost in a senseless task. They saw wasted effort, a strange monument to a sorrow they couldn't comprehend. They did not see the methodical precision, the careful shoring of the walls with timber hauled from the deep woods, or the intricate ventilation shaft, cleverly hidden amongst a cluster of rocks. They saw a hole. Clara saw a promise. A promise she had made to herself in the silent, frozen aftermath of losing her husband, a promise that she would never again be at the mercy of the sky. Rook would often lift his head, a low rumble in his chest, as the distant sounds of mockery drifted up the hill. Clara would simply place a hand on his neck, her touch calming the animal's protective instincts. "Let them talk, boy," she would whisper, her voice barely disturbing the air. "Words don't keep you warm," and she would return to her work, the rhythmic scrape of her shovel a prayer against the coming cold, a sound no one in Redemption Creek was yet able to understand. They saw a woman digging. They had no idea she was building an ark. The shelter was a marvel of practical ingenuity, born from desperation and foresight. The entrance was a heavy, angled door of reinforced timber, set so flush against the hillside that, when closed, it was nearly invisible. It opened into a sloping tunnel that led deep into the earth, far below the frost line. Inside, the main chamber was wider than any room in her cabin, with a floor of packed earth and a ceiling high enough for a tall man to stand upright. A stone-lined hearth and chimney were built into the far wall, venting smoke through the clever flue that exited discreetly on the hill's crest. Shelves carved directly into the earthen walls were lined with preserved foods in ceramic jars, beans, corn, salted meats, and dried fruits. In one corner, a deep well, painstakingly dug until it hit a clean, cold aquifer, promised a limitless supply of fresh water. But Clara's preparations extended beyond the shelter itself. On the south-facing slope above the hidden door, she had terraced the land into a sprawling vegetable garden. In the summer, it was a riot of color and life, providing far more than she could eat alone. What she didn't preserve, she sold quietly in town, ignoring the condescending smiles that accompanied the transactions. Below the garden, she had excavated a deep pond, lined it with clay, and diverted a small, seasonal creek to fill it. Here, she raised hardy mountain trout, their silver bodies flashing in the clear water. It was a closed, self-sustaining system. The garden fed her, the pond fed her, and the vast, neatly stacked cords of firewood that flanked her cabin promised warmth for a winter longer than any man could remember. Each log had been cut, hauled, and split by her own hand. The townsfolk saw the woodpile and shook their heads. Enough there to burn down the whole town, one would say. What's a lone woman need with all that? They saw excess, a kind of madness. They couldn't see the brutal lesson that had taught her that enough was a dangerous illusion. Her husband had believed enough. He had chopped just enough wood for a normal winter, stored just enough food for a normal season. But the blizzard that took him had been anything but normal. It had come early, a ravenous white beast that devoured the landscape, and all their careful calculations of enough. Clara would never make that mistake again. Her work was a silent testament to that vow, a physical rejection of the flimsy assurances the world offered. While the town laughed, she worked, her hands calloused, her back aching, but her purpose as clear and cold as the water in her well. Rook was her constant companion in this labor, never straying far, his presence a quiet comfort. He would lie in the shade, watching her, his ears twitching at every sound, a silent, vigilant guardian of their small, fortified world. The trip into Redemption Creek was a necessary evil, a journey into a chorus of whispers and poorly veiled stares. Clara needed salt, lamp oil, and coffee, things her hillside fortress could not provide. With Rook heeling silently beside her, she walked down the main street, her gaze fixed forward, her posture straight and unwavering. The town's rhythm seemed to stutter at her arrival. Women sweeping their porches would pause, their brooms held motionless. Men gathered outside the saloon would fall quiet, their conversations replaced by a low murmur as she passed. Today, the judgment was more overt. She stepped into Gable's general store, the bell above the door announcing her arrival with a cheerful jingle that felt entirely out of place. Mr. Gable was behind the counter, polishing a countertop that was already gleaming. "Well, look what the badger dragged in," he said, his voice loud enough for the two farmers lingering by the Cracker Barrel to hear. "Come up for air, have you, Clara? Thought you might have dug clear through to the other side by now," the farmers chuckled. Clara met his gaze without flinching, her expression unreadable. "I need 10 pounds of salt, a gallon of oil, and a bag of coffee beans," she stated, her voice calm and even. As Gable weighed out the salt, he continued his performance. "Big plans for all this salt? Preserving the whole mountain, are we? I hear that hole of yours is big enough to host a town dance. Maybe we should all come up there when the first snowflake falls." His laughter boomed in the enclosed space. "You might be glad for it one day," Clara said softly, the words holding no malice, only a simple, unshakable conviction. This only fueled his amusement. "Oh, I'm sure we will. The day the sky falls, we'll all come knocking on a Clara's folly," he smirked, pleased with his own wit. As she paid for her goods, a quieter man who had been inspecting harnesses in the corner stepped forward. It was Mr. Finch, an older rancher with kind eyes and a face weathered by decades of sun and worry. He simply nodded at Clara, a gesture of respect that stood in stark contrast to Gable's mockery. "That's a fine-looking dog you have there," Mr. Finch said, his voice gentle. "He looks smart, he is," Clara replied, a flicker of warmth in her eyes. His good company. Mr. Finch held her gaze for a moment longer than was customary, and in his look she saw not pity or ridicule, but a flicker of genuine curiosity, perhaps even understanding. He was a man who understood the unforgiving nature of the land, a man who knew that preparation was not madness, but wisdom. The brief exchange was a small island of decency in an ocean of scorn. Clara gathered her supplies, gave a final, silent nod to Mr. Finch, and walked back out into the street, Rook's powerful form a reassuring presence at her side. The whispers resumed behind her, but they seemed fainter now, muffled by the quiet dignity with which she carried herself. Back on her hill, the world of men and their small cruelties faded away. Here, there was only the rhythm of work, the whisper of the wind through the pines, and the steady, comforting presence of Rook. The bond between the woman and her dog was forged in silence and shared solitude. He was more than a pet, he was a partner, a confidant, a living link to the husband who had given him to her as a pup. In the evenings, after a long day of labor, they would sit together on the small porch of her cabin as twilight painted the sky in hues of purple and orange. She would talk to him, her voice low and soft, telling him about her day, her plans for the garden, her worries about the coming winter. Rook would listen, his head resting on her lap, his amber eyes fixed on her face as if he understood every word. He was her shadow and her shield. When she worked in the garden, he lay at the edge of the tilled earth, a vigilant sentinel. When she ventured into the forest for wood, he scouted ahead, his keen senses alert to any danger. He knew her moods better than any person. A slight slump in her shoulders would bring his wet nose nudging her hand. A sigh of weariness would earn a soft whine of concern. He was the keeper of her unspoken grief and the witness to her incredible strength. One night, as a sliver of moon hung in the inky sky, she sat by the fire in her small cabin, mending a tear in her canvas work coat. Rook lay at her feet, his body a warm, solid weight against her legs. The silence in the cabin was profound, a stark contrast to the lively, crowded homes in the town below. For a moment, a wave of loneliness, sharp and cold, washed over her. It was in these moments that the weight of her task, the sheer scale of her isolation, threatened to crush her. She paused her sewing, her hand resting on the dog's broad head. He stirred, lifting his gaze to meet hers. In his eyes, she saw not pity, but a deep, unwavering loyalty. A simple, profound promise: you are not alone. She leaned down and pressed her forehead against his. "What would I do without you, boy?" she murmured into his fur. The dog responded with a soft lick on her cheek. It was enough. The wave of loneliness receded, replaced by a quiet resolve. The town could have its laughter and its community. She had Rook, she had her hill, and she had a purpose that burned brighter than any hearth in Redemption Creek. The change came subtly at first, a series of quiet signals that only a person deeply attuned to the natural world would notice. For a week, the sunsets had been unnervingly vibrant, the sky bleeding with colors too fierce for early autumn. The air, instead of carrying the crisp, clean scent of the coming cold, grew heavy and still, holding a strange, metallic tang. Clara noticed the squirrels, usually frantic in their gathering, had vanished. The birdsong that typically filled the mornings had fallen silent. The forest at the edge of her property was unnervingly quiet, as if holding its breath. She stood on her porch one afternoon, watching the horizon. A strange, milky haze was creeping in from the north, blurring the sharp edges of the distant peaks. It wasn't fog and it wasn't cloud, it was something else, something older and colder. Rook sensed it too. The dog had been restless for days, pacing the perimeter of the cabin, his ears constantly swiveling, a low, anxious whine escaping him whenever the air stirred. He refused to go into the woods and stuck to Clara's side like a burr, his body tense with a primal understanding of the impending threat. That evening, he refused to eat, instead sitting by the cabin door, staring northward, the fur along his spine slightly raised. Clara trusted his instincts more than any weather forecast from a town almanac. She ran a hand down his back, feeling the tension in his muscles. "I know, boy," she whispered. "I feel it too." The time for slow, methodical preparation was over. A frantic energy seized her. She spent the next 2 days in a blur of motion, driven by a cold certainty. She harvested the last of the root vegetables from her garden, even the ones that weren't quite ready, and moved them into the shelter's root cellar. She netted half the trout from her pond, cleaning and salting them for storage in the cool darkness of the earth. She double-checked the seals on her preserved goods, reinforced the hinges on the heavy shelter door, and hauled the last of the split firewood into a dry, covered space just inside the tunnel. Her movements were efficient, wasting no energy, her mind a sharp, clear instrument focused on one thing: survival. The sky continued to darken, the milky haze thickening into a solid, bruised-looking ceiling that pressed down on the world. The temperature began to plummet, the air turning sharp and biting in a way that felt unnatural for this time of year. A few townsfolk glanced up at the strange sky, but they dismissed it, their lives dictated by calendars and habits, not by the silent warnings of the earth. They saw a grey sky. Clara saw a declaration of war. The blizzard did not arrive. It detonated. One moment, the world was gripped in a silent, grey stillness; the next, it was consumed by a maelstrom of white fury. There was no gentle prelude of falling flakes. A single, violent gust of wind slammed into the valley like a physical blow, and with it came the snow, a solid, horizontal wall of ice and powder moving so fast it seemed to scream. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes, the cold so profound it felt like it could crack bone. From her small cabin window, Clara watched the world disappear. The trees at the edge of her property were erased in an instant. The view of the town below was swallowed by the blinding chaos. The roar was deafening, a relentless, high-pitched shriek that vibrated through the very logs of her cabin. Rook was at the door, barking, not with aggression, but with a desperate urgency. "It's time," Clara said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. She grabbed the last essentials, a lantern, her mending basket, and the worn photograph of her husband that she kept on the mantel. With Rook pressing against her legs, she opened the cabin door and was immediately assaulted by the storm. The wind tore the breath from her lungs, and the snow stung her face like 1,000 tiny needles. For a terrifying second, she was completely blind, enveloped in a churning vortex of white. But she knew the way by heart. Head down, she fought her way across the few yards of open ground to the hillside, her hand outstretched, searching for the familiar feel of the heavy wooden door. She found it, fumbled with the latch, and pushed it open. The storm tried to follow them in, a roaring beast clawing at the entrance, but she and Rook scrambled down the tunnel. With a final, desperate heave, Clara pulled the massive door shut. The heavy bar fell into place with a solid, echoing thud. And then, there was silence. The deafening roar of the blizzard was instantly reduced to a distant, muffled hum, the rage of the world held at bay by a few feet of earth and timber. She lit the lantern, and a warm, golden glow filled the space. The air in the shelter was cool but still, free of the wind's vicious bite. Rook shook the snow from his coat, then trotted over to the hearth and lay down, letting out a long, shuddering sigh of relief. Clara walked to the stone fireplace and began to build a fire. Her hands were steady, her movements calm and deliberate. Outside, a monster was tearing the world apart. Down here, in the heart of the earth, in the place everyone called her folly, she was safe. She was ready. The contrast was absolute, a universe contained within the thickness of a door. Outside, in Redemption Creek, chaos reigned. The blizzard descended with a ferocity no one had ever witnessed. It was not a storm, it was a physical assault. The wind, armed with ice and snow, acted like a battering ram, splintering the flimsy facades of the town's buildings. The roof of the general store was peeled back like the lid of a tin can, its contents scattered and buried in seconds. Homes built with hope and hurried labor were no match for the sustained violence. Walls groaned, timbers cracked, and the very foundation seemed to tremble. People were trapped, their doors and windows sealed shut by immense, fast-forming drifts. The cold was a living entity, seeping through every crack, stealing the heat from their hearths faster than they could burn their meager woodpiles. Panic gave way to a chilling, primal fear. Mr. Gable, who had laughed the loudest, now huddled with his wife and 2 young children in the back room of his ruined store, blankets piled over them, the sound of the wind like a freight train in their ears. The temperature in the room was already well below freezing, and his son was coughing, a dry, ragged sound that terrified him more than the storm. He had always believed in the safety of walls, the security of a roof over his head. Now he knew they were just suggestions, easily dismissed by the power of the sky. Meanwhile, deep beneath the fury, Clara stoked her fire. The flames crackled merrily in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the earthen walls. The shelter was filled with a gentle, life-giving warmth. She put a pot of hearty stew on to simmer, the rich aroma of salted meat and root vegetables soon filling the air. She sat on a low wooden stool, the lantern on a small table beside her, and resumed her mending, her needle moving with a steady, peaceful rhythm. Rook snored softly by the fire, his body completely relaxed, a picture of perfect contentment. Here, there was no wind, no roar, no life-threatening cold. There was only the quiet hum of the fire, the scent of cooking food, and the profound, unshakable feeling of safety. She had built more than a shelter, she had built a sanctuary. She had carved out a piece of the world that the storm could not touch. Every log in the fire, every jar on the shelves, every stone in the hearth was a testament to her foresight, a victory over the forces that had once shattered her life. The town had called it a folly. They had laughed at her obsession. But as the blizzard raged above, Clara knew the truth, it wasn't a grave she had been digging. It was a womb. The sound, when it came, was so alien in the deep quiet of the shelter that it took a moment to register. It was a frantic, desperate pounding against the outer door, nearly lost in the muffled howl of the storm. Rook shot to his feet in an instant, a deep, protective growl rumbling in his chest. Clara placed a calming hand on his back and listened. The pounding came again, weaker this time, accompanied by a faint, hoarse shouting. No one should be out in this. No one could survive it. Her first instinct was a cold knot of self-preservation. This was her sanctuary. She had built it for herself, to protect herself from a world that had offered no such protection. But the shouting came again, a name carried on the edge of the wind, Clara. Please? It was a voice she recognized. Mr. Gable. The man who had led the chorus of mockery. The irony was as bitter as the cold outside. Rook growled again, his body rigid, ready to defend their home. "It's all right, boy," Clara whispered, her decision made in an instant. Her husband hadn't died from the cold alone, he had died because he was alone, with no one to help. She would not make the same choice. She took the lantern and made her way up the sloping tunnel. Unbarring the heavy door took all her strength. As she heaved it open a few inches, the blizzard roared into the tunnel, a blast of ice and wind that extinguished her lantern and plunged them into darkness. A figure, completely covered in snow, stumbled and fell inside. It was Gable, his face a mask of frozen desperation. "My family," he gasped, his words ragged, his breath fogging in the frigid air. "The store. The roof is gone. We're freezing. My boy." His so cold behind him, other shapes emerged from the swirling white chaos. It was his wife, clutching their two small children, and behind them, 3 other families, including the young blacksmith and his pregnant wife. They were the heart of Redemption Creek, beaten and terrified, their pride stripped away by the storm. They looked at the dark, earthen tunnel not as a hole in the ground, but as the only hope they had left. Clara stood aside, her silhouette framed against the raging blizzard. She said nothing. "No, I told you so," no recriminations. No hesitation. She simply held the door open and ushered them out of the storm and into the quiet, waiting dark. One by one, they stumbled past her, their faces a mixture of awe, shame, and overwhelming relief. The shelter, designed for 1, became an ark for 17. The townspeople huddled together in the main chamber, their shivering bodies slowly thawing in the radiant warmth of the fire. Clara relit the lantern, and as the golden light spread, they saw the full extent of her preparations. They saw the neat rows of preserved food, the deep, clear well, the abundant firewood. They saw not madness, but a profound and humbling wisdom. Their eyes, which had once held ridicule for this place, now held something akin to reverence. Clara moved among them with a quiet, efficient grace. She ladled hot stew into bowls for everyone, starting with the children. She gave them dry blankets from a storage chest. She checked Mr. Gable's young son, whose cough had worsened, and prepared a warm herbal tea to soothe his throat. She did it all without a word of complaint or triumph. Her silence was more powerful than any speech could have been. As they ate, the shame in the room was palpable. Mr. Gable, his face streaked with grime and melted snow, could not meet her eyes. He sat with his family, his gaze fixed on the fire, the man's bluster and arrogance completely gone, replaced by a deep, humbling gratitude. It was Mrs. Gable who finally broke the silence. She looked at Clara, her eyes filled with tears. "How?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How did you know to do all this?" Clara paused, a bowl in her hands. She looked around at the faces watching her, the people who had been her neighbors and her tormentors, now her dependents. She walked over to a small, carved wooden box on a shelf and took out the faded photograph of her husband. She held it out. "His name was Thomas," she said, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the quiet hum of the shelter. "5 years ago, we were caught in an early spring blizzard. Not as bad as this, but bad enough. We thought we were prepared. We had enough wood for a week, enough food for a month. The storm lasted for 2 inches. Her gaze drifted into the distance, reliving the memory. The wood ran out. The food ran low. He went out to try and find help. He never came back." She looked directly at them, her eyes holding no anger, only a profound, heartbreaking sorrow. "I promised him I would never be caught by the sky again. I promised I would be ready for a storm that lasted forever." A heavy silence fell over the room. In that moment, they understood everything. This wasn't Clara's folly, it was a memorial. It was a promise kept. It was a testament to a love so strong it had literally moved a mountain. The laughter and the jokes, the whispers and the scorn, they all came rushing back to them, tasting like ash in their mouths. When the storm finally broke 3 days later, the silence it left behind was as shocking as its roar had been. Clara unbarred the door to a new world. The sun shone with a blinding intensity on a landscape transformed, buried under a dozen feet of pristine, sculpted snow. Redemption Creek was gone. Here and there, a shattered roofline or a lonely chimney poked through the vast white blanket, like markers in a graveyard. The town they knew, the world they had built, had been erased. But the people had survived. They emerged from the shelter squinting into the bright light, their faces pale but their bodies warm, their children safe. They were alive because of the woman they had ridiculed, saved by the obsession they had mocked. The dynamic had irrevocably shifted. There was no more laughter. There was only a quiet, profound respect. As Clara began the arduous task of digging a path from her shelter to her cabin, Mr. Gable took the shovel from her hands. "No," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Let us," and they did. The men of Redemption Creek, who had once leaned on their porches and joked at her expense, now worked. They shoveled, they dug, they cleared a path, their movements driven by a shared, unspoken debt. The women helped Clara organize what was left of her supplies, taking inventory, planning how to make it last. They no longer saw a strange, solitary widow. They saw a leader. They saw a savior. In the days that followed, the shelter became the new heart of the town. It was a town hall, a hospital, a kitchen, and a home. Clara taught them what she knew. She showed them how to ration the food, how to draw water from the well, how to keep the fire burning efficiently. She moved with the same quiet competence as always, but now, people listened. They watched her every move, eager to learn the wisdom they had once dismissed as madness. Mr. Finch, the quiet rancher, found his way to her hillside a week later. His own ranch had been better prepared than most, and he had weathered the storm. He looked at what she had built, and then he looked at her, a deep admiration in his eyes. "The whole town is talking," he said. "They're calling it Clara's Ark." She simply nodded, a small, sad smile touching her lips as she looked out over the buried valley. The name no longer mattered. The laughter was a distant memory. She had kept her promise to Thomas. In preparing for the worst, she had saved everyone. Rook came and sat beside her, leaning his weight against her, a warm and solid presence in the cold, new world. The town of Redemption Creek was gone, but its people remained, humbled and changed, ready to rebuild, not just their homes, but their understanding of what it meant to be a neighbor, and their respect for the quiet woman and her dog on the hill.